We have fire. It's burning down pretty good now. Just wasted all this time and effort. Let's give this another shot. Hello, Bill here with Pale Horse Survival and Tactical. Glad you could join me. Today I'm going to share a nearly lost Native American technique of processing California buckeye as a food source. Stay tuned. Hey, welcome back. We have in front of us here is the California buckeye, and it is deciduous. It's already dropped its leaves. I shot a identification video, I believe it was last year, on how to identify this native California botanical, and I will post that link in the description box below if you want to take a look at that. This it's decorated with the seed pods, and Native Americans would prepare these as a food source. They're known as a buckeye. This is how it gets its name. When the pod, the sheath on the seed splits, it looks like a buck's eye with two eyelids open. And I intend this video to be for informational purposes only, because these seeds have to be prepared precisely right. They contain a lot of tannins, and they also contain a poisonous glycoside known as esculin. Once they're prepared properly, they are edible. However, it is your responsibility to make sure that you're not allergic to any botanicals. So I'm going to present this information as an informational video. I don't intend anybody to actually attempt to do this. It is easy to poison yourself if it's not done, if these aren't prepared properly. Here's some more. You can see all the seeds hanging up here. And there's another one. These are split open. Another one with the buck's eye look. So if anybody attempts to prepare these, and if you you get sick or you wind up injured or worse, I'm not going to be responsible for that. Again, this technique is intended for informational purposes only, and the information on preparing these is pretty much a lost art. I wanted to present it in video form, and I'm going to demonstrate the preparation of these from start to finish. Now, how you want to harvest these are not ripe if they're still hanging on the tree. So what you do is you look underneath the tree. This just happens to be down in a ditch, and I'm not going to walk down in there to retrieve these. You look underneath the tree. When they're ripe, the sheath splits open, and That one will be ripe also, even though it's in the sheath, it's off the tree. There's another one in the sheath right there. But these are all ready to be picked up. And there's quite a few of them down there. So you want to get them shortly after they are released from their sheathy encasement and gather them up. You know, if they've been sitting there for 2 or 3 months in the rain or whatever, they're going to spoil. But grab them shortly after they're released and gather them up, and we will go ahead and move to the next phase of this video, the preparation portion. Stay tuned. Hey, I'm back. I just wanted to add, I stress to a lot of people the importance of identifying trees, especially deciduous trees that have medicinal or food resources, to be able to identify those trees in their dormant stages just by looking at the bark. So I wanted to give everybody a close-up of the bark here. It's kind of a silvery bark, and these do get so big that they become trees. This is it's actually classified as a shrub, but I've seen them as big as trees, 30, 40, 50 foot in height. And here are the seeds that I have picked up below the tree. And I've got a decent amount here for demonstration purposes. And they're pretty good size. Once these are prepared, the insides they're white and they will be very soft, just like very similar to mashed potatoes. And they have their nutritional content is very similar to white potatoes, russets. Again, they are toxic, very toxic. They have to be prepared properly, and that's what we're going to move to in the next portion of this video. Stay tuned, I shall return. Hello, welcome back. I'm going to conclude the rest of this video here at home, and as I'm going to prepare these nuts using modern conveniences, but I'll also narrate it as I go along and describe how the native people would use the natural materials to process and leach these nuts. Before we begin, I want to state once again that this video is intended for informational purposes only. It's not intended for anybody to go and try this. If you don't know what you're doing, don't do it. And I want to put this in here again before we move to the processing phase, because these nuts are very toxic. They can make you very sick. They can possibly kill you. And my advice is, if you don't know what you're doing, don't do it. This video is intended for informational purposes only. This is pretty much a lost art. I don't think there's too many people that even practice this anymore. And I wanted to do the video here so there is historical documentation on how this was performed. But you know, don't go and try to process these things. The poisonous glycoside escalin that's in these nuts is very similar to rat poison, and again, it has to be. These things have to be processed just right. And if anybody viewing this video decides to take it upon themselves to process this stuff and to eat these, and they get sick or worse, you've done it against my advice, and I will not be responsible for any injuries or death that occurs. So I got to throw that in there, guys. It's nothing to play with. So also, Buckeye grows from coast to coast, but there's different species than the California Buckeye. I believe they're all in the same family, and I believe they're called horse chestnuts or something like that. The only one that I'm aware of is the California Buckeye, the one that I'm profiling here. To the best of my knowledge, the trees, botanical being all in the same genus, I believe the processing of the nuts would be exactly the same because they contain the same toxins, the esculin and the tannins. So the processing would apply to any of the Buckeye species that's found coast to coast. So, but again, guys, if you don't know what you're doing, this is an informational video. If you don't know what you're doing, don't process these. So, and if anybody does decide to do it, they get sick or worse, you've done so against my wishes, and I warned you ahead of time. So you assume all responsibility for any injuries or worse that may occur. So, with that said, I'm going to move ahead with this video, and we'll begin with the processing. Stay tuned. Hey, welcome back. We have in front of us here are the Buckeye nuts. I have a flat stone here and a hammer stone and a pot. So basically what you want to do with these, you want to fracture the shells because the water will not penetrate the shells. Not only when we start to boil these, it cooks the flesh of the nut, but it also begins part of the first stage of the leaching process. So if the shells are not fractured, the water's not going to get inside and leach these. So traditionally, this is exactly what they would do with a hammer stone and a flat rock, and just like that. You don't have to bust it into pieces. Just hit it until it cracks, and you have a nice wide fissure. And so the way Native Americans would prepare these is exactly what we're doing here. These things are pretty tough. Just like that. And I don't think I'm going to do this entire, maybe about half of this for demonstration purposes. Just like that. You can see the interior of these is white, and once they cook, they're going to be very similar to mashed potatoes. Very similar. And since these are just like that, since these are toxic, and you're handling this, don't put your hands in your mouth or in your eyes. Make sure your hands are washed before you handle any food, or after handling these raw nuts in this manner, make sure you wash your hands before handling food or sticking your fingers in your mouth or your eyes or whatever. These are really tough. Just like that. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to process probably about half of this. Probably about half of this bowl, and then we're going to move this to the stove and to the next stage in this processing. Stay tuned. I'll be back. Yeah, just one more piece of advice. When you're processing these, you're going to get little pieces that are going to fly out. If you have pets, namely dogs, I don't think cats would try to eat these, but if you have dogs, make sure you you keep the dogs away from these. If they eat any of these pieces, they're going to get sick or possibly die. So just be very mindful of that. If you're processing them in your backyard or garage or whatever, and you have a dog running around, just be very careful that you keep them away from there. When you're done, just clean it all up and make sure there's not going to be any pieces laying around that they might come along and eat. So anywho, stay tuned. I'll be back. Hey, welcome back. I have the pot on the stove, and I put in just enough water to cover these. And as they cook, they'll kind of cook down. The shells will become a little softer, and the flesh will become much softer, almost like mashed potatoes. Traditionally, the Native Americans they had baskets with the weave so fine that they would hold water. And what they would do is they would place the fractured Buckeye nuts in the basket, put in enough water to cover them, and then they'd use the hot rock boiling technique. They'd pull stones out of the fire that were hot, place them in there, they'd get the water boiling, and then as stones cooled, they would remove them and put them in the back in the fire to be reheated. And this process would go on for about 20-25 minutes is the boiling time on these once the water starts to boil. To move the rocks out of the fire into the basket, and from the basket back to the fire, they would use tongs. I recently made a video on how to make improvised tongs for that purpose of handling hot rocks, and also excuse me, also for handling coals, pulling coals out of the fire for coal burning containers and whatnot. So we're going to boil this for about 20 to 25 minutes, and it's starting to heat up now. And then I'm going to take a potato masher, and I'm going to start mashing these down in the pot, and that's going to release the flesh from the shells. The way the Native Americans would do, they'd use a stone that they would use in the basket, and they'd use it to mash the nuts after they were boiled. So we're kind of improvising here. Anywho, stay tuned. I'll come back as soon as these are cooked. Yeah, it's just getting ready to boil here. I wanted to pop back in and show you the suds that are forming in there. Buckeye nuts contain saponins, which is also another component that needs to be leached out of the nuts here. So the saponins, tannins, a lot of tannins in here, and the poisonous aspect, the esculin, the glycoside. So all of that will be leached out during this during the following process. Native Americans would harvest these in the fall, and the Buckeye nuts, they stay pretty shelf stable. You just store them where it's dry, and they'll make it about a year, maybe a little bit longer. They're not quite as shelf stable as acorns and bay nuts, for instance, but they do store okay if they're kept dry. You just store them in the shell just as you would bay nuts and acorns. But they native people would do that, some of the tribes here in California, because their main food source was acorns. There's a ton of native oak trees here, and the thing with oak trees, Some years they produce a really heavy yield and some years they do not. And so they would store these up in anticipation that the following year may possibly be slim. And if it was, they could always fall back on their Buckeye nut supply. That way they wouldn't go hungry through the winter. So it was kind of a little insurance policy that they did. But anyways, so this is just starting to boil. It's about 1:30, so I'm going to go ahead and let these cook for about 25 minutes, and then we'll move to the next stage of the video. Stay tuned. Hey, welcome back. These cooked for about 25 minutes. I just cut the fire to them a little bit ago, and just to demonstrate, they cook up just like mashed potatoes. So the flesh is nice and soft. So how the native people would prepare these, once they were at this stage, they would take a flat stone and start mashing them in the basket. So I'm improvising and using a potato masher. A little difficult with one hand. So I'm going to mash the heck out of these, and then after they're mashed well, you go back in. What they would do, they'd take their fingers, and once the liquid was cool enough, and rake their fingers through and pull out the shells and discard the shells. You can see the flesh comes right out of the shells. So you just mash them and keep mashing until the flesh has released from the shells, and then once the liquid is cool, I'll use my fingers to go through and pull the big pieces of the shells out of there. And then we'll move to the next stage. Stay tuned, I shall return. Hey guys, I'm just using the potato peeler, the potato masher rather, and stuck it down in here, and I've been pulling the shells out this way. It's been working pretty good. And then I just stick them over here in this bag. It's been doing a pretty good job. These fine pieces I'll hand pick out once we start the leaching process. But you can see it's a pretty thick material. This would be like a real thick mush. Native people would eat this as a mush. Once it's leached, it can be spread out thin to dry and then stored that way, and then water could be added to it in a bowl or whatever. There's another piece of shell here. And it can be eaten as a mush, or it can be thinned even further and drank. And the nutritional value is very similar to potatoes. This is it's a pretty thick solution. So this is going to be transferred over to a colander that I have set up with a bandana on it, and we're going to begin the leaching process. Stay tuned, I'll be back. Okay, so what I'm going to do here, I have a 5-gallon bucket and a colander. And then a bandana. I've used bandanas for leaching the tannins out of acorns in the past. I actually have a video on the channel that I used a cold leach method in a bowl for Quercus lobata valley oak, which is the species of oak tree that we have a lot here in abundance. and it worked really well. Came out really nice. I actually still have a Ziploc baggie of the meal. It's over a year old and it's still fresh. It's storing very well. I'll show you that in a little bit. But I've got this. The way the native people would do this, this is the pot that was on the stove. The way the native people would do this, they would perform this operation, the entire operation, on the banks of a creek or a stream where they were next to their water source, and they would scoop out a very shallow depression in the sand, up a ways away from the water. It wouldn't be next to the water, but 6, 8, 10 feet away from the water or so, and they would scoop a shallow depression out, and they would line that depression with wide leaves like redbud leaves or maple leaves, and overlap the leaves, put down a 2 or 3 layer thick mat of leaves, and then they would pour this meal onto the leaves, kind of spread it out, and then they would take water from the stream and pour it in. It would kind of pull up in there, and it would slowly leach down into the sand through the leaves. That was the leaching process. Well, I don't have access to any of that, so I'm kind of improvising here today, and I'm going to use a bandana with a colander. I'm going to pour the meal into the bandana, just like this. The leaching process traditionally would take a few hours. They would, as soon as the water level would start to drop, as it would filter down, through the leaves, they would keep adding water. So it was one trip after another from the water source back in, and keeping the water topped off. And it'd be a couple of hours at least, and then after a few hours they would take a finger, dip it in to some of the mash, and then taste it, because escalin, the poisonous glycoside escalin, is bitter, and so are the tannins. So they would use their taste buds as a guide to know when it was safe to consume. So when a taste test was done at a few different spots on the mash, not just in one spot, and you can also kind of gently stir the stuff around too while it's being leached, and it'll settle down to the bottom, and then you can test it out and let your taste buds be the guide. And once there's no bitterness detected at all, then it was considered safe to consume. Any bitterness or whatever, rinse the mouth out, don't swallow it, and continue with the leaching process. So I'm going to go ahead and get some water here in this bowl, and we're going to start the leaching process. And since I'm kind of adapting here, improvising, once the 5-gallon pail gets up to about 3/4 of the way, I'll have to pull the colander off, empty the pail, and so it'll be a little bit of a project here. So, and then while this is being done, it can be stirred around by hand, and any little bits of shell that are still in the material here can be extracted with the fingers. Stay tuned, I'll be back. The bandana here is doing exactly what I wanted it to do, to kind of hold the water so it doesn't just run right through really fast, so we get more of a leaching action going on here. So I'll be messing around with this for probably, it'll be a couple of hours, I guess. Yeah, see, it's going to leach nice and slow, so that's actually a good thing, so it doesn't just go right through. Yeah, I can hear the water. Don't know if the camera's picking that up. Can hear the water running into the bucket through the colander. So that's good. That's a nice slow trickle going down through there. It's not just washing through on the outsides, and it seems like a nice even trickle down through the material. So that's a good thing. Every so often I get in and stir this all up and then add more water too. So I'm already seeing some pieces of shell here, so yeah, this sounds like it's doing exactly what it should be doing. Kind of pour this from a height so it stirs it up. Kind of suspends the material. If you don't have any bandanas in your preps, I highly recommend it. Adding a few good quality bandanas. They've got a lot of uses in a survival situation. You've got a lot of that material suspended now, and if it sits for a while, it will settle down to the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to work on this for a while, and I will pop back in a while and let you know how things are going. Stay tuned, I'll be back. Well, I've been leaching now for a few hours, and I just wanted to demonstrate what I've been doing here. I've been pouring from a small height here to stir up the mash and get it kind of suspended in the solution. It seems to be working pretty good, so I'm kind of running this around the edges. I'm going to leach, probably run 2 more bowls of water through here, and then I'm going to let the water trickle through. This is what I've been doing in the middle, just kind of stirring it up. And I'll run probably 1 more bowl through, and let most of the water trickle out, and then I'll come back and I'll give it a taste test and see if I detect any bitterness. Here's what I was talking about earlier. This is a bag of Quercus lobata Valley Oak acorns that I processed about a year ago. And I used the cold leach method in a bowl with the bandana, and these really came out good, and these have been storing very well. I've ate some of these, and they're actually really tasty. The cold leaching has the the benefit of preserving all of the valuable oils in the acorn, and those are saturated fats, so they're very shelf stable, so they actually store pretty well. They keep for quite a long time. Bay nuts also have these saturated fats and are very shelf stable. So go ahead and let this leach here, and I'll run one more bowl through, and then we'll see how it tastes. Check the not even half full, maybe a third full in here. This is a 5-gallon bucket, so it'd be interesting if we're able to leach with that small amount of water. You know, I was thinking, if the native people pulled water directly out of a stream or a creek in order to leach these, back then they didn't have the pollution in the creeks and the streams like we do nowadays. Cryptosporidium and giardia were pretty scarce. Back in the day, they really didn't have to purify water. They could drink directly out of the creeks and the streams, and without ill effects. Nowadays, sadly enough, there's a lot of cryptosporidium and giardia. So I'm thinking, in a primitive situation, if you're pulling, there's two ways to do it. You can pull water directly out of a creek or a stream to leach this material, but then there's the issue of the spores from the crypto or the giardia being in the material. So once this is leached and then allowed to dry and stored as a flour, I think what I would do personally, I would before I would consume it, I'd put some in a little bit of water. If I'm going to make a thicker solution for a cereal, or thinner as a soup, I think I would boil it, bring it up to a boil for, to be safe, a good 6 or 8 minutes or so, depending on the altitude. If you're in the high altitude, I'd go 10 or 12 minutes to kill any crypto or giardia spores that might be in there. The other alternative would be, if you had a large pot, you could boil water, or if you had a couple of pots, you could boil water, but then you'd have to pull it off and allow it to cool sufficiently enough before you poured it onto your solution to continue your leaching process. But that would kill any spores, any microbes in the water before you use it for leaching. So just a few things that came across my mind. My mind's always thinking on things like that, so always running things through. Anywho, I'm going to go ahead and refill this bowl. You can see about 2/3 of what I poured in there is already worked its way down through the material. So I'm going to go ahead and fill that bowl back up and give it another shot. I guess I'll just let the camera roll here. Another idea that I had, as I mentioned earlier, I've got probably a dozen bandanas in my preps and in various places in my gear. Bandanas are absolutely awesome item to have, multiple uses. I was thinking, in a primitive situation, could scoop out the depression the way the natives did in the sand on the banks of a creek or a stream, And instead of lining it with leaves, if leaves were not available, a bandana or two would work perfect for that. Just spread it out on the sand. If you had a lot of mash to process, you could overlap 2 bandanas or even 3, overlap them by about 1/3, so you don't have your mash running through into the sand. And just spread them down flat on the depression, and then just put your mash on there, spread your mash out, and then use that as use the bandana as a means to line the leaching pit. Just another idea that came into my mind while I'm doing this. Hopefully this should be leached. So I'm going to go ahead and let this drain down until it's relatively dry, until I can stick my pinky in there and scoop a little up, and I'll come back when I'm ready to do that, and so it's all documented, and give it a taste test and see if any bitterness is detected. And if it's not, then we're going to move to the final stage of the video. So stay tuned, I shall return. Okay, so this has pretty much finished draining here, and that's a pretty good amount of mash here. That's still a little bit of water there in the center, still draining a bit. Yeah, it's that was from about a dozen Buckeye nuts. It produced a pretty fair amount. Pretty impressive. I still have probably in that bowl that we've seen in the beginning of the video, the plastic bowl, I still probably have 12 or 15 nuts in there. So anywho, the moment of truth. I'm going to give this a shot here. I'm going to sample from a few different locations just in case some area got leached better than others. I suspect it leached pretty evenly because I was stirring it up pretty good by pouring the water in. But let's give this a little shot here. This is very similar to potatoes. No bitterness at all. It's completely bland. Let's try another spot. Get down underneath. Let me get down underneath here and see how there's actually quite a bit in here. Yeah, I don't detect any taste at all. No, it's bland. No, it's bland. I think this was a smashing success here. Yeah, it's completely bland, flavorless, and that is what it should be. Yeah, no bitterness at all. So that means the esculin and the tannins are gone. It has a texture very similar to mashed potatoes, completely bland. So what I'm going to do is, well, I'll just keep the camera rolling since it's obviously leached. We're going to transfer this to cookie sheet, and I'm going to spread it out and let it dry. So what I'm doing here is, you guys can see, I just gathered up the bandana and it's the ball of material here, squeezing out as much water as I can. Yeah, I'm getting no aftertaste off of that at all. It actually leached. It leached a whole lot sooner than I had anticipated. And it came off the bandana pretty nice too. Bandana's not bad at all. Give that a wash. Just hand wash it, let it dry. So here's the dough, and any shell pieces that are found can be picked out at this point. So I'm going to spread this out. There's quite a bit of material off of just 12 nuts. Really impressed with this. Still a few shell pieces here and there. There's another one right here. Another piece. This would probably make, I know the native people, they would make a soup out of this, basically potato soup, and they would have boiled venison on the side. So I'm going to let this air dry. This stuff would probably, I'd imagine the native people would consume it immediately, but I'm curious as to how well it would dry and then can be broken up into like a flour and stored that way. Unsure how well that will work since it's cooked, so it's a little experimental at this point, but I figure what the heck, might as well give it a try. So I'll let this dry for a while and then probably flip it over so it starts drying on the underside, and I'll just kind of keep an eye open for any mold or any signs of decomposition on it. So, but that's where we are. It's leached, no bitterness. So I'm going to go ahead and clean up my mess and get my bandana cleaned up and stick this off on the table and let it air dry for a few days, and then I'll bounce back with the camera and document how well this is doing, and then wrap the video up. So stay tuned, I shall return. Hey, I just wanted to document how much water it took to leach that amount of material. The bucket water level's up to about here, so it's not quite it's a 5-gallon bucket, so it's not quite 2.5 gallons. I'd say maybe 2 gallons of water. So I'm going to go dispose of this since this is toxic, and pretty happy with how that worked. Stay tuned, I shall return. Hey, welcome back. It's been 3 days since I put the mash on the cookie sheet, and in an attempt to dry it, see if it would store that way, and what I figured would happen happened. You can see the mold. So that answers the question that once the material is cooked, it needs to be consumed immediately. The Native Americans would do that. I was just conducting an experiment to see how well it would, if it would dry out and store that way, and it will not. So that answers that question. We don't know unless we conduct a few experiments. Well, I had a lot of fun making this video. It was nice to document some ancient techniques that are all but forgotten nowadays in this day and age. I hope all of you enjoyed the video as much as I did making it. Please like, subscribe, and share. And as always, I will see all of you very soon on the next one. Everybody take care. Bye-bye.